Matej CURKO was a Slovak serial killer known as the Slovak cannibal. CURKO lived in the small Slovakian village of Kisak. Authorities found GPS coordinates on a computer owned by CURKO, which led the discovery of 2 victims' bodies in a shared shallow grave. It was discovered that he had killed and eaten 2 women who had volunteered to be murdered and cannibalized. CURKO's computer suggested they had agreed to be eaten. The procedure involved the pair meeting in the forest, where CURKO would drug the victim before stabbing them in the heart. He would cut up the body using a meat cleaver or one of his knives and mask the odor of rotten flesh using pepper. He would eat whatever part of the body he desired, storing the rest in his refrigerator. CURKO died in a firefight with the Slovak police force on May 10, 2011. Interpol has sought to establish conclusive links between CURKO and up to 30 other missing persons. Leonard Thomas Lake was an American serial killer. During the mid-1980s, he and his accomplice, British Hong Kong-born Charles Ng, raped, tortured and murdered an estimated 11 to 25 victims at a remote cabin near Wilseyville, California, in the Sierra Nevada foothills, located 150 miles east of San Francisco. They killed the men and infants immediately but kept the women alive, raping and torturing them, before killing them or allowing them to die from their injuries. After his 1985 arrest on unrelated charges, Lake swallowed cyanide pills that he had sewn into his clothing and died 4 days later. Human remains, videotapes, and journals found at Lake's cabin later confirmed Ng's involvement, and were used to convict Ng on 11 counts of capital murder. Charles Ng is a convicted Hong Kong-born, Chinese-American serial killer. Ng committed numerous crimes in the United States. He is believed to have raped, tortured, and murdered between 11 and 25 victims with his accomplice Leonard Lake, at Lake's cabin in Calaveras County, California between 1983 and 1985. They filmed themselves raping and torturing their victims. Police estimated that 21 missing women were shown as victims of malicious attacks in the tapes, or captured on still photos. After his arrest and imprisonment in Canada on robbery and weapons charges, followed by a lengthy dispute between Canada and the US, Ng was extradited to California, tried, and convicted of 11 murders. He is currently on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Richard Speck was an American mass murderer, who killed 8 student nurses in their South Deering, Chicago residence on the night of July 13 to 14 in 1966, via stabbing, strangling, slashing their throats, or a combination of the 3. 1 victim was also raped. A 9th potential victim survived by hiding beneath a bed. When asked why he killed the nurses, Speck shrugged, and jokingly said, "It just wasn't their night." Convicted of all 8 murders on April 15, 1967, Speck was sentenced to death. His sentence was reduced to 400 to 1,200 years in 1972. This was later reduced to 100 to 300 years. Speck died of a heart attack while incarcerated at Stateville Correctional Center on the eve of his 50th birthday. On the evening of October 18, 1902, after a row over his wife's pawning of his son's boots to pay for a drink, he stabbed her in the back, and she died soon afterwards, charged with willful murder. He gave evidence in his own defense, saying that he had been drunk and his wife had rushed at him, but he did not remember anything more. A policeman gave evidence saying that he had heard quarreling in the house and had to disperse a crowd from outside about half an hour before the attack. The jury returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter and the judge sentenced him to penal servitude for 12 years. He served 3 before being released. He died on the Titanic as one of its many victims. On the night of the sinking, William had managed to find a life jacket, but his son-in-law, Walter, had not, so William gave him his, contributing to Walter's survival. Roberto Jose Carmona, known as the Human Hyena, is an Argentine thief, rapist and serial killer, initially imprisoned for killing a teenage girl in 1986. Carmona proceeded to kill 2 inmates in separate incidents and culminating with the murder of a taxi driver during an escape attempt in 2022. When he was 23 years old, he robbed 3 teenagers and kidnapped one, a 16-year-old girl named Gabriela Seppi. He proceeded to rape and kill Seppi, then abandoned her body on the outskirts of the city. She wasn't found for 29 days, causing widespread fear throughout the city. Even after authorities arrested Carmona and he confessed to the crime, Carmona is considered one of the most dangerous murderers in the country's history, and is the second longest serving prisoner. He is currently imprisoned at Cruz d'Alege prison. Mark Brandon Chopper Reed was an Australian convicted criminal and gang member. He began his criminal career by robbing drug dealers. He later graduated to kidnapping and torturing members of the criminal underworld, using a blowtorch or bolt cutters to remove the toes of his victims as an incentive for them to produce cash so that Reed wouldn't kill them. While in Pent Ridge Prison's H Division in the late 1970s, Reed launched a prison war. The Overcoat Gang wore long coats to conceal their weapons and were involved in several hundred acts of violence against a larger gang. Reed had a fellow inmate cut both of his ears off to be able to leave H Division temporarily. Reed claimed to have been involved in the killing of 19 people and the attempted murder of 11 others. He died of an illness on October 9, 2013, aged 58, in Parkville, Victoria at Royal Melbourne Hospital. 14-year-old, Renee Cara O'Brien, set out on the evening of March 10, 2002, with the sole intention of stealing a car, finding 60-year-old grandfather Kenneth Piggott asleep in his four-wheel drive. She struck him in the head 8 times with a hammer, and threw his dead body into the Waitara River. Kenneth Piggott had been drinking with friends at a local pub on the evening of March 10th. Falling asleep in his four-wheel drive, he was woken by Renee O'Brien and her friends. While Carolyn distracted Mr. Piggott, Renee produced a hammer. She smashed the man over the head 8 times before he fell to the ground. The other 2 girls kicked him before they all dragged him over the stop bank and into the river. Renee Cara O'Brien was sentenced for the murder in February 2003. On October 12, 2011, Scott Evans Decra committed a mass shooting at the Meritage Hair Salon in Seal Beach, California. Previously in 2007, a restraining order was filed against Decra, barring him from possessing firearms, which had expired at the time of the shooting. 8 people were shot and only 1 victim survived. He was armed with 3 handguns and reloaded at least once during the attack, which lasted 2 minutes. It remains the deadliest mass killing in Orange County history. Scott Evans Decra, who was involved in a custody dispute with his ex-wife, who was one of the shooting victims, pleaded guilty to the shooting. On September 22, 2017, Decra was sentenced to 8 terms of life imprisonment without parole and 1 term of 7 years to life for attempted murder. On December 11, 1990, Victor Farr attempted to kidnap and then shot and attempted to murder 2 women outside a Lake City, Florida bar. He escaped by forcibly taking a car in which a man and woman were sitting. The man fled, but Farr managed to escape with the woman still in the car. Later, while being pursued by police officers, Farr deliberately crashed the car into a tree, attempting to kill both himself and his hostage. The woman was severely injured in the crash and subsequently died from her injuries, while Farr was only slightly injured. Farr was sentenced to death on May 13, 1991, but this sentence was overturned. Farr was resentenced to death on December 8, 1993. His death occurred on the 15th of January, 2015, aged 53, at Union County, Florida, USA. Randall Whitfield is an American serial killer, dubbed the I-5 Killer, for the I-5 highway running from Washington to California, where he committed multiple sexual assaults and murders. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to rob, rape, and murder his victims. He would also repeatedly shoot victims in the head. Whitfield typically concealed his identity by wearing a hoodie, a fake beard, and most curiously, a strip of athletic tape across his nose. His first murder was on October 9, 1980. CAROLYN Ayers had been bludgeoned and stabbed repeatedly in the neck. He was convicted of 3 murders, is suspected of killing up to 18 people, and suspected to be involved in 44 murders. Whitfield is incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary. Martha Rendell was the last woman to be hanged in Western Australia. She was found guilty of the willful murder of her de facto husband's son, Arthur Morris, in 1908. She was also suspected of the killing of his 2 daughters Annie and Olive. It was alleged that she killed the children by swabbing hydrochloric acid on the back of their throats. She beat them severely and insisted they call her mother. The medics thought the children had died of diphtheria, and it was only when an older boy ran away that the truth began to emerge. Martha, however, always protested her innocence, maintaining that she was treating the children for diphtheria. There was considerable public outrage at the time, the press portraying her as a scarlet woman and wicked stepmother. On October 6, 1909, she was hanged at Fremantle Prison. She is buried at Fremantle Cemetery. Known as the Missoula Mauler, Wayne Nance shot and stabbed his victims, often raping them beforehand. Between 1974 and 1986, he invaded homes across Montana. On April 11, 1974, Nance invaded the home of and tied up Donna Pounds, raped her at gunpoint, then fired 5 bullets into her head. 5 years later, the body of Devonna Nelson was found near Beavertail Hill State Park. 3 months later, 16-year-old Marcella Bachman's body was found in Missoula's woods. In September 1985, another unidentified body was found. Law enforcement believe Nance committed at least 6 homicides, although it is strongly suspected that he killed many more. Wayne Nance was shot and killed by his final intended victim on September 3, 1986. Manuel Delgado Villegas was a Spanish serial killer known as the Strangler of Porto. Villegas confessed to the murders of 48 people of different gender, age, and sexual orientation in 3 separate countries. Police only investigated him for 22 murders in Spain. Villegas would beat, suffocate, strangle, rob, and commit acts of necrophilia on his victims. Some of his victims were killed with hand-to-hand combat techniques that he learned while in the Spanish Foreign Legion. Delgado killed his first confirmed victim in 1964 at age 21 and remained active until his arrest at 28 in 1971. Delgado hid one body and returned to have sex with it on 3 consecutive nights before he was arrested. He was diagnosed with a severe mental disorder and XYY syndrome. Villegas interned in a mental institution until his death in 1998. Christy Abrahams is an Australian murderer who killed her 6-year-old daughter on July 13, 2010. Because she refused to put her pajamas on, she was beaten and kicked to death by her mother. After the murder, her boyfriend, Robert Smith, put Keisha's body into a suitcase. 5 days after her death, the pair took the suitcase with Keisha's body inside to a burial site in Sydney's Outer West. Smith dug a shallow grave and poured petrol over Keisha's body and burned it. Abrahams reported her daughter missing. In April 2011, the pair were arrested over Keisha's murder. Smith was jailed for a minimum of 12 years and Abrahams for a minimum of 16 years. Robert Terry Smith was released in April 2023. Should child killers get life in prison? Let us know what you think in the comments. Gregory Brazel is an Australian serial killer, also known as Bluey. Brazel was dishonorably discharged after holding 5 privates hostage in an army exercise in Healesville, Australia. He was persuaded to release the hostages and no one was harmed. He killed 3 female victims between 1982 and 1990. Brazel fatally shot a female hardware store owner in a 1982 armed robbery, and murdered 2 female prostitutes in 1990. Brazel is often described as one of the most manipulative and violent prisoners in Victoria's prison system. He became eligible for parole in 2020. As of April 2023, he is still serving 3 consecutive life sentences at HM Prison No. 1, in Lara, Victoria, Australia. Eric Heinstock, a 9th grader at the Weston High School, entered the school with a handgun and a shotgun, both owned by his parents. After arriving at school at approximately 8 a.m., he aimed the shotgun at a teacher, then wrestled from him by a custodian. A struggle ensued, and the shotgun was taken away. Still armed with the handgun, Heinstock sought out and confronted the school's principal, John Alfred Klang. Klang attempted to subdue Heinstock. In response, Heinstock shot Klang several times. Klang then managed to sweep away the gun and wrestle Heinstock to the ground, where others helped to hold him down. Staff and students apprehended Heinstock, holding him until the police arrived. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and will be eligible for parole in 2037 when he is 46 years old. Paul Ogerzov was a German railway worker and serial killer, known as the S-Bahn murderer, stalking female victims around Rummelsburg on the Berlin Line during World War II. Between 1939 and 1941, he lurked aboard empty carriages waiting for potential victims. He relied heavily on the fact that lone female passengers were not suspicious of a uniformed employee of the S-Bahn. Ogerzov would attack, strangling, or striking the victim in the head with a 2-inch thick piece of lead-encased telephone cable. He was a sadist who killed for sexual satisfaction. He killed at least 8 women, raping most of them before they were beaten to death. He was 28 years old when his trial opened on July 24, 1941. Ogerzov was executed by a firing squad on July 26, 1941. C.G. Katagiri was a deranged pilot, flying Japan Airlines Flight 350, holding 174 passengers and crew. In 1982, he crashed the plane, killing 24 people and injuring dozens. His troubles started around the fall of 1976. C.G. started feeling different and noticed a decrease in his self-confidence. He also started seeing hallucinations. The crash caused 54 passengers to have slight injuries, 95 passengers to have serious injuries, and 24 passengers to die. Most died when they were thrown into the sea and drowned, while others died of head injuries and other injuries. C.G. was admitted to the Tokyo Metropolitan MISSOULA Hospital for treatment. Katagiri has since been released from psychiatric care and lives near Mount Fuji. Buddy Justice was an American spree killer who raped and murdered 3 women across Georgia, Florida, and Virginia on October 3, 1978. Justice broke into the Ironto, Virginia trailer of pregnant nurse Ida Mae Moses, 21, and proceeded to rape and murder her. Justice moved south, picking up an 18-year-old hitchhiker, Dale Goins. Along the way, they kidnapped, raped, and murdered Rosemary Jackson, a 32-year-old housewife, while she was leaving a store in Atlanta. Days later in Florida, Justice and Goins kidnapped, raped, and murdered Stephanie Hawkins. Convicted of all 3 murders and receiving death sentences in all 3 states, Justice was executed in Virginia in 1990. Joseph Taberski, aka Mad Dog, was a murderer who was sentenced to death after a string of brutal robberies and murders in Connecticut during the 1950s. 6 people were killed during a string of armed robberies and murders that became known as the Mad Dog killings. A number of others were shot, beaten, or pistol-whipped but survived. Taberski earned his nickname due to the savagery of the killings that condemned him to death. In 1957, Connecticut package store hours were modified to close at 8 p.m. from 11 p.m., due in part as a response to the crimes of Taberski. He was executed by electric chair for the Mad Dog killings. At the age of 36, Taberski donated his body to Yale School of Medicine. His ashes were later buried in the garden of Christ Church Cathedral. Dale Nelson was a sexually dysfunctional lumberjack. Dale fought his impotence with violence. On September 5, 1970, tanked up with booze and hatred, he drove to his wife's relative's house where he killed a woman and her 7-year-old daughter. He slit the young girl's gut and munched on the half-digested food in her entrails. He then went to a neighbor's house and killed all 6 inside, sodomizing an 8-year-old girl as she died. He returned to the first house and stole the corpse. Dale was located on September 6 in a shack in the woods, and surrendered to police without incident. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Prosecutors say that should he win parole at any time, they would put him on trial for the remaining 6 murders they say he committed. Dale Nelson died of throat cancer on February 10, 1999 while in prison. John Ingvar Lovgren was a Swedish serial killer who confessed to 4 murders committed between 1958 and 1963 in the Stockholm region. Lovgren was convicted and sentenced to closed psychiatric treatment at Salberga prison. He went under the name, the Girl Killer, because his last 2 victims were young girls. After he was arrested, Lovgren confessed to another murder, the unsolved murder of 26-year-old Agneta Holm, in Fruingen in June 1958. Despite this, Lovgren was never convicted of her murder and her case has since been statute barred. Police, however, consider it solved and Lovgren to be the assailant. He was, at the time of his death in 2002, no longer in treatment due to poor health, which he had received from his cancer. He was buried at Sala Cemetery. Kaspars Petrovs is a Latvian serial killer known as the Strangler from Riga. Petrovs confessed to strangling 38 elderly female residents of Riga, Latvia from 2000 to 2003. He was known to rob, strangle, stalk, and murder his victims. After the murders, he put his victims' corpses to bed and prepared them in such a way, as if they were sleeping. Petrovs followed the victims home and forcibly entered their apartments or posed as a gas company employee. Petrovs was initially charged with 38 murders, 8 attempted murders, and a number of theft and robberies. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the robbery and murder of 13 elderly women due to a lack of evidence in the other cases. Kaspars Petrovs was sentenced to life in prison on May 12, 2005. Porn stars Amanda Logue, 30, aka Sunny Day, and her boyfriend Jason Andrews, decided to kill tattoo parlor owner Dennis Abrahamson, have great sex and then take as much of his money as they could. In the early hours of May 15, 2010, Logue serviced Abrahamson while Andrews waited outside for her signal to attack. They stabbed and bludgeoned Abrahamson with a sledgehammer. His body was found face down on a massage table in his home. The couple snatched $6,000, credit cards, and a video camera before leaving. In January, Andrews pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. On May 21, 2012, Logue pleaded guilty to charges of second-degree murder. Logue, known for bondage, will herself be restrained for the next 40 years. Jennifer San Marco was a former U.S. Postal Service employee and mass murderer who killed 7 people in Goleta, California. On January 30, 2006, San Marco shot and killed her one-time neighbor, Beverly Graham, and then subsequently drove to the mail processing plant at which she previously worked in Goleta, California. San Marco entered the sprawling plant by driving through a gate behind another car. She gained entry to the building by taking an employee's identification badge at gunpoint. She then shot and killed 6 employees of the plant with a pistol before taking her own life. San Marco apparently believed that she was the target of a conspiracy centered at the Goleta Postal Facility. Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department speculated that San Marco's paranoia and history of mental illness may have motivated her to commit the murders. The Shafia family murders took place on June 30, 2009 in Kingston, Ontario. Shafia's sisters Zainab, Sahar, and Deepi, along with Rona Amir Mohammed, were found dead inside a car that was discovered underwater in front of the northernmost Kingston Mills lock of the Rideau Canal on the same day. Zainab, Sahar, and Deepi were daughters of Mohammed Shafia and his wife TOOBA Mohammed Yahya. The couple also had a son, named Rona, who was herself infertile, was the first wife of Mohammed Shafia in their polygamous household. On July 23, 2009, Mohammed, TOOBA Yahya, and Hamed were arrested on charges of 4 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. They were found guilty of all 4 counts by the jury in January 2012. Philip Carl Jablonski is an American serial killer from California, who was charged with the April 22, 1991 death of Fatima Van in Indio, California. She was found shot and sexually assaulted, lying naked in a ditch in the Indio desert, with the words, "I love Jesus," carved in her back. Her body had cut off ears and removed eyes. In April 23, 1991, his wife Carol and her mother were murdered at their home in California. Spadoni was shot and suffocated, then stabbed, while Peterson was sexually assaulted and shot. Jablonski was also charged with the murder of Margie Rogers in Utah on April 27, 1991. He was captured the following day. Jablonski died on December 27, 2019 at the age of 73 in San Quentin State Prison. Filip Capisoda was a Montenegrin male model. On March 16, 2010, the bodies of Capisoda and his girlfriend, 32-year-old singer, Kasenija Pajcin, were found in her apartment in Belgrade. Both had gunshot wounds to the head. Police suspect a murder-suicide, with Capisoda as the shooter. Early investigation reports stated that the dead bodies were discovered by the singer's mother, and that the gun used in the homicide was found next to Capisoda's body. It is believed that the motive for the murder-suicide was jealousy. He was buried on March 19, 2010 in Cetinje, the day before Kasenija's funeral. His funeral was attended by his brother Petr Capisoda and his friend, singer Goga Sikolik, among others. Richard shot his wife, both his sons, the neighbor, and then himself, on August 19, 1999, in a suburb outside Sacramento. 3 of the victims died at the scene. Stephen LaFranco, the neighbor, survived until early the next morning. Cody LABATT, the 5-year-old son of the murderer's father, remained alive until mid-afternoon. The rage that drove LABATT to familicide stemmed from the fact that his wife and their neighbor had begun a relationship. After both marriages fell apart, for LaFranco, it was his second marriage. He lived in the house on Laguna Point Way and his wife moved out. The LABATT marriage next door was disintegrating, although with more bitterness. The quintuple murder-suicide was the largest single slaying case in Sacramento since the April 1991 siege of a Good Guys store that left 6 people dead. The Mbazamali Taki, aka the sugarcane killer, is a South African serial killer who killed 13 women aged 18 to 25, dumping their bodies in agricultural plantations. On January 19, 2011, Taki was sentenced to 13 life sentences for the murders. Body parts of some of his victims are alleged to have been provided to a local traditional healer or sangoma. Taki was remanded at Westville Prison during his trial. On February 21, 2010, Taki attempted to escape from the prison. He fell from the roof of his fourth-floor cell, seriously injuring himself. On March 2, 2010, Taki, now using a wheelchair, entered court. On December 23, 2010, Taki was convicted on all charges. Václav Mrazek was a Czech serial killer who killed 6 women and 1 man in Komutov. He would beat, shoot, and murder his victims. He had an extensive criminal history prior to his killing spree. In 1951, Mrazekis is thought to have committed his first murder, the murder of a 15-year-old girl. While primarily sexually motivated, he also robbed his victims, and he was also a necrophiliac, and at trial one peculiar claim made by him was that he hated the sight of blood. He was convicted of 127 total crimes. He thought that there was no death penalty, and expected a maximum sentence of 10 years. He was convicted, and sentenced to death in 1957. In 1957, Václav Mrazek was executed by hanging at the Prague Pankrug Remand prison in Prague, Czech Republic. A mother of 3 has been sentenced to life in prison for murder for a second time. Catherine O'Connor pleaded guilty at the Central Criminal Court yesterday to killing her 42-year-old neighbor John Forrester. Drug addict O'Connor is already serving a life sentence handed down last year after she admitted murdering another man, Jonathan Duke. The 37-year-old killed the English father of 4 at Bridge House, Bandon, Cork, on November 12, 2011. Mr. Forrester died of blunt force trauma and asphyxia. His hyoid bone had been broken and there was bruising to his throat. The victim also had a fractured skull, several broken ribs, a broken hip and lacerations to his head and mouth. They both lived in a flat at the house. She then wrapped his body in cable wire and carpet, while his feet were tied with the belt from her cardigan, and dumped it in the river Bandon. The DAEGU subway fire of February 18, 2003, killed at least 198 people and injured at least 147. An arsonist set fire to a train stopped at the Junggongno station in South Korea. The fire then spread to a second train which had entered the station from the opposite direction. The arsonist was Kim DAE-HAN, a 56-year-old unemployed former taxi driver who had suffered a stroke in 2001. Kim was dissatisfied with his medical treatment and had expressed sentiments of violence. He later told police he wanted to kill himself, but to do so in a crowded place. He boarded train 1079 on line 1, carrying a duffel bag which contained 2 milk cartons filled with a flammable liquid, possibly paint thinner or gasoline. Kim died in prison on August 31, 2004. Genaro Ruiz Camacho Jr. was an organized crime leader in Texas. On May 20, 1988, David L. Wilburn, who worked for Sam Wright, and had a mental disability, unwittingly interfered when Camacho and 2 accomplices tried to kidnap Wright. Evelyn Banks, and Banks' 3-year-old son Andre, Wilburn was forced to lay down in Wright's home and was then shot in the back of the head. After the murder, Wright managed to escape, but Camacho and his accomplices kidnapped Evelyn and Andre Banks and killed them 3 days later. After this he fled to Mexico. The FBI set up a sting operation to lure Camacho back to the United States. Camacho was arrested as he crossed the border near McAllen, Texas. He was convicted and was executed by lethal injection on August 26, 1998. David Alan Gore was an American serial killer who confessed to, and was convicted of 6 murders in Vero Beach and Indian River County, Florida in the 1980s. Gore was executed by lethal injection in 2012. Having been on Florida's death row for 28 years, Gore had an accomplice, his cousin Fred Waterfield, and the pair were dubbed the Killing Cousins. Waterfield was convicted of 2 murders, and is currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences. In 1976, prior to their committing any murders, police jailed and questioned both Gore and Waterfield after Angela Hummel Austin accused them of raping her at gunpoint. The cousins insisted the sex was consensual, and they were not charged in her case. Gore targeted at least 4 additional women who escaped with their lives. Fred Waterfield is an American serial killer. The Killing Cousins confessed to, and were convicted of 6 murders in Vero Beach and Indian River County, Florida in the 1980s. Waterfield had an accomplice, his cousin, David Alan Gore, and the pair were dubbed the Killing Cousins. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to torture, strangle, stalk, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. He was raised by his uncle, David Gore's father. Gore was executed by lethal injection in 2012. In 1985, Waterfield was convicted of 2 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. Fred Waterfield is currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences at the Avon Park Correctional Institution in Florida. Lynn Turner. Starting in 1995, her first husband, Glenn Turner, allegedly died of natural causes after being apparently sick with the flu. 6 years later, in 2001, the death of her second husband, Randy Thompson, under remarkably similar circumstances, aroused the suspicion of law enforcement. After investigation, it was determined by authorities that Lynn Turner had murdered both her husbands by poisoning them with antifreeze. She was arrested 10 months later after her second husband's death and was tried for Glenn Turner's murder in 2004. She was found guilty and went to trial again for murdering Randy Thompson in 2007 and was also convicted. Turner died in prison on August 30, 2010. The cause of death was suicide by toxic overdose of blood pressure medication. CAROLYN WARMUS is an American murderer and former elementary school teacher, who was convicted at age 28, of the 1989 murder of her lover's wife, 40-year-old Betty Jean Solomon. After a hung jury at her first trial in 1991, Warmus was convicted of second-degree murder, and illegal possession of a firearm at her second trial in 1992. She served 27 years for the murder, and was released from prison on parole on June 17, 2019. The murder case attracted national media attention and led to comparisons with the 1987 film Fatal Attraction, about a love affair that turns deadly. The Warmus case went on to inspire made-for-TV movies, 6 different episodes across multiple television broadcasters, and at least 1 book. On the morning of July 18, just 6 weeks after getting out of prison, Jack Abbott went to a small cafe called the Bennyvin in Manhattan. He clashed with 22-year-old Richard Adan, son-in-law of the restaurant's owner, over Adan's telling him the restroom was for staff only. Abbott stabbed him in the chest, killing him. After some time on the run, Abbott was arrested and charged with murder. At his trial in January 1982, he was convicted of manslaughter and given 15 years to life. On February 10, 2002, Jack Henry Abbott hanged himself with a bedsheet and shoelace in Wenda Correctional Faculty on Sunday, February 10. He left a suicide note, whose contents have not been made public. Abbott developed a subjective perspective that every encounter was potentially threatening. In December 1990, Ronald Dale Yates was sentenced to death for the capital murder of 70-year-old Ruby Meeks Dodson. Yates was 28 years old at the time of the crime. Ruby Dodson was stabbed to death on September 23, 1989. That afternoon Yates and a friend, Charles Vernon, drank beer and smoked marijuana and crack cocaine. When they arrived at the house they opened the car's hood and the two men began looking at the motor. They told Dodson they were having trouble with their car. Yates asked for a glass of water and as Dodson entered the house Yates went in after her. Vernon also went in and went straight for Dodson's bedroom, where he began looking for money. Ronald Yates slashed the elderly woman's throat. He was put to death by lethal injection in Virginia on April 29, 1999. On November 29, 1998, Jasper killed a 33-year-old musical engineer who owned a recording studio in San Antonio, and was a business partner of Jasper. Jasper had created his own record label and had his own rap group. He went to the recording studio of the victim, walked up behind him and grabbed him by the hair and slit his throat. The victim was then stabbed to death. He covered the victim with a black sheet in order to not have to look at him. Jasper then began loading vehicles with the equipment inside the studio. Jasper made several trips taking the property from the studio. Upon returning to the scene of the crime, he was observed to be suspicious and eventually apprehended by police. Jasper was executed by lethal injection in Texas on March 19, 2014. Body parts were found in June and July 2007. In the Kamas region along the B1 in the greater Windhoek area between Rehoboth and Okahandja. These body parts were wrapped in garbage bags and belonged to two different women. In 2005 two similar murders of women occurred. Those two murders have subsequently also been attributed to the B1 butcher. The head and an arm of the last victim were found in August 2007. Further body parts of the same victim were discovered in September 2007 near Grootfontein in the Etiozondjipa region. This woman wasn't identified. Police took this sequence of events as a clue that the murderer might have moved from Windhoek further northward. In October 2007 investigations were helped by 3 senior serial murder detectives from the Republic of South Africa. It is believed the series of murders will never be solved. Francisco Guerrero Perez was a Mexican serial killer, also known as the Mexican Barbazul. Guerrero killed 20 female prostitutes in Mexico City between 1880 and 1888 by strangling them or cutting their throats, in some cases also decapitating them. He then threw their bodies in the Consulado River. In 1908, he murdered an old woman and was given the death penalty, but died in prison of natural causes before he could be executed. He was the first serial killer to be captured in Mexico. He was arrested on June 13, 1908, sentenced to death at the Palace of Lecumberri, a former prison, in Mexico City. Perez was convicted on charges of murder and other possible charges during his lifetime. The Watertown trunk murder. Mary Farmer took an axe to her neighbor Sarah Brennan, stuffed her corpse into a trunk, then assumed Sarah's identity and ordered the deed to Sarah's house transferred into her own name. She then evicted Sarah's husband, who had no idea where his wife was, from the house and moved into it herself, bringing with her the trunk containing Sarah's corpse. Sarah's mutilated and decaying body was found in the trunk on April 27, 1908. When she was found out, Mary tried to pin the murder on her own husband James. Mary was arrested and after deliberating only 3 hours, the 12-member, all-male jury returned a guilty verdict. On March 29, 1909, Mary Farmer was electrocuted at Auburn State Prison. According to her priest, she died a good Catholic. Joseph Timothy Keel arranged to pick up his father-in-law, John Simmons, on the pretense of going to check out the offices at a hog farm where he worked. He confessed that he fired a shot with a .22 rifle at Simmons, while the victim was in his truck on the hog farm. After Simmons got out of the truck holding a knife, Keel shot him again. He then helped the wounded Simmons back inside his truck, and later fired another shot into the truck, hitting Simmons in the head. The exact reason for the murder is not clear. Keel told lawmen that he and Simmons had had a fist fight. Keel claimed that he set him up to kill because he was a wife beater. Keel received the death penalty because of a 1987 conviction for involuntary manslaughter in the beating death of his infant son. He was executed by lethal injection in North Carolina on November 7, 2003. The February 9th killer was an unidentified, suspected serial killer, believed to be responsible for the 2006 murder of Sonia Mia and her unborn baby, and also the 2008 murder of Damiana Castillo in Salt Lake County, Utah. The murders were committed on the same day, 2 years apart. In 2009, analysts with the Utah Crime Lab linked DNA taken from both scenes and matched the same unidentified man. The corresponding police departments concurrently released a description of the perpetrator as a Hispanic male, in his late teens or early 20s. Juan Antonio Arreola Murillo formally pleaded guilty in Utah to 3 first-degree felony counts of aggravated murder. A sentencing hearing is scheduled for August 10, 2023. Yvonne Hiller, the Longcrest woman who shot 3 co-workers at the Kraft Nabisco cookie plant in Northeast Philadelphia in 2010, Common Pleas Court Judge Benjamin Lerner found Hiller guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of LaTanya Brown, 36, and Tanya Wilson, 47, 1 count of attempted murder for shooting Bryant Dalton, 41, and several other offenses. At an emotional hearing Monday, Lerner heard from the victims' relatives and Hiller's niece. Hiller spoke briefly, asking forgiveness of the victims' families and her own. Hiller believed that her co-workers had been poisoning her for years. She argued with them that day, and had been escorted by a security guard out of the building. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole on September 24, 2012. Andres Panda was a convicted Belgian serial killer. The bone fragments plucked from the mud in Panda's basement had been studied and tested, but authorities were never able to determine whose remains they were. They were the remains of men and women, all of them over the age of 35, but their identities remained a mystery. He died in prison on December 23, 2013, while serving a life sentence for the Hammer murders of his 2 wives and 4 children. After he was arrested, his daughter, partner in crime, and former lover, Agnes Panda confessed being involved in at least 5 of the murders. A former clergyman, he was dubbed the Diabolical Pastor by the Belgian press. With 13 victims and counting, authorities refused to speculate on the lethal pastor's final body count. Amir Khayyam is a Pakistani serial killer. He was abandoned by his father and went to live with his uncle. Khayyam displayed violent tendencies at a young age and was thrown out of school. He would also be thrown out of his house by his brothers and sisters after he would beat them up. On September 25, 2003, his uncle was murdered by unidentified assailants. On February 28, 2004, a suspect named Hafiz Abid was arrested but shot and killed himself in a police van after taking a gun from a sleeping policeman. His uncle's murder caused Khayyam to want to take revenge against society. From June to July 2005, Amir Khayyam killed 14 homeless men with bricks or stones and was known as the Brick Killer. He was caught after assaulting a man with a stone and sentenced to death on May 10, 2006.